Good afternoon, Transylvania community and guests. My name is Summer Taylor, and I'm the Student Government Association President, and I'm your moderator for this evening. Thank you for joining us and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and the Political Science Program hosting this panel discussion on the January 6th storming of the Capitol. I imagine that many of us are here with questions and concerns regarding the interesting events of January 6th and its aftermath. As a review of that day, we can recall that on the morning of January 6th, the Georgia Senate runoff was being called for the two senatorial Democrats, and simultaneously Trump supporters were gathered and rallying in Washington, D.C. Around noon, President Trump addressed his supporters about the stolen election and to never give up. And around 1:30 p.m., Trump supporters surrounded the U.S. Capitol and the fallout ensues. Luckily, you have come to the right place to discuss these events of January 6th because I am joined this afternoon with 5 panelists who are going to be answering many questions and hopefully providing you some clarity and understanding. I would now like to briefly introduce these panelists, starting with Dr. Steve Hess. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Steve Hess, Assistant Professor of Political Science. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Next, I would like to welcome Dr. Deidra Denney, the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Deidra Denney.
Thank you. I would also like to welcome Mark Jackson, Associate Professor of Psychology.
Hello, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I would like to welcome Dr. Don Doogie, Professor of Political Science.
Well, Ms. Taylor has said all that needs to be said.
And finally, I would like to welcome Dr. Carrie Hallman, Associate Professor of Writing, Rhetoric, and Communication.
Thanks for letting me join this wonderful panel.
Awesome. So the format of this afternoon's panel will be that each of our panelists will be given one specified question that they will answer within a 2 to 3 minute response. And then we'll move from that specific question to the next portion of this panel discussion, where I will then ask panelists questions from the audience. So please, while our panelists are speaking to this first question, put questions in the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen as an icon, and we will get to as many questions from the audience as possible. I will also remind you that this panel has closed captions, which can be activated by clicking the icon also found on the bottom of your screen. With that being said, let's get started. Starting with Dr. Hess, the question is, why were the rioters able to enter the Capitol building? Why was the security inadequate?
So this is a multi-step process of failures. A lot of us are probably surprised and concerned about the fact that, the country with the largest, military in the world at the seat of our government would have, you would see a breach of security on this level. We're talking about, with the Capitol, we have a Marine barracks, which is just several blocks away from the Capitol building. When a security breach like this happens on this level, it requires failure at multiple steps. So in terms of intelligence warnings, this is not a secret conspiratorial operation. The people involved with this were very public about what they were planning to do. This was very much monitored on social media. There were very specific posts about people arming themselves, about getting gas masks, about carpooling, about plane tickets, about intentions to harm policymakers. It's also, during a year in which we've seen a lot of Homeland Security assessments about domestic terrorism being the greatest threat to the American people. We saw an attempted abduction of a governor that was foiled by the FBI. So there should have been a lot of earlier, intelligence assessments that said that this was there's a high danger that this might happen. There were very few interdiction methods. So as people progressed to DC to organize, many of them with gas masks, nooses, tactical gear, bulletproof vests, zip ties, explosives, pipe bombs, firearms, Molotov cocktails, people amassed, on the mall, and there was very little effort to try to prevent people from entering DC and being part of this demonstration. There was also very faulty security planning. So, the Capitol Police, 2,000 some police officers are responsible for keeping the Capitol safe and taking care of members of Congress and keeping them safe. There was not an effort to deploy the DC National Guard. There was, once the attack had started, there were efforts to muster the Maryland and Virginia National Guard, but they cannot enter, unlike most National Guards, they cannot actually enter DC unless they've received approval from the Pentagon. So Mayor Bowser will by the two governors, and they were not given permission to enter DC until 2 hours into the breakthrough. The only security forces deployed were the Capitol Police themselves and some members of the Metro Police from DC. They were not armed and they did not have riot gear on. They were, it was very sparse security detail that was in place. And so they were very quickly overwhelmed. On the day of, there was not proper monitoring of the crowd. So the crowd became, there were threats issued. They became, there was talk of going to the Capitol. There were, the crowds were much larger in size. There was just a lot of violent rhetoric that emerged from the crowd. So a lot of reporters that were in the crowds just reported it was a very heated, very angry group of people. So if you know the geography of DC, it's a good walk from where the rally happened. It was about a good 35, 40-minute walk to the Capitol. So with proper monitoring, they would have said that this is, this is a dangerous crowd that's starting to approach. They're a very angry crowd. They have lead pipes. They have all of this weaponry. And so there was improper monitoring. And then once the, once the first wave of, the first detail of Capitol Police were overwhelmed, there was a very slow response to call for reinforcements. And like I said before, when there was a request for more National Guardsmen to come in and reinforce the Capitol, they were denied and delayed for at least an hour by the Pentagon. And so they were unable to reinforce them. And so it wasn't until 2 hours after the breach that you started to see federal law enforcement and National Guardsmen actually enter and start to disperse the crowd. So there was 2 hours in which the Capitol itself was a lawless place, with looting and damaged property. And so, there should be quite a bit of reassessment about the security that's provided for the Capitol.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To kind of follow up on that, Dr. Denney, how was the security response different from other protests, specifically the Black Lives Matter protests that also took place in Washington, D.C. in June 2020? Can you kind of compare those? And are there reasons for those differences in terms of responses? And perhaps are there differences in the motives in terms of how those protests happened?
So sure. A picture's worth 1,000 words as far as I'm concerned in what we're talking about today. For the past 7 months, including up until yesterday, we've been subjected to pictures of the last 8 minutes of George Floyd's life in the face of his torturer, which set off a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests that we've seen. We saw in June when the Black Hawk helicopters, the police, the law enforcement on horseback, the tear bombs, the rubber bullets and what have you that were raining down on the protesters in front of the White House were used to clear them away from St. John's Church in June in order for our president to have a photo op at St. John's with an upside down Bible till someone told him he needed to write it up, right side it up. And so, you know, when I look at the landscape here, when, you know, all summer long, 7 months, I'm seeing George Floyd in the face of his torture as he dies in 8 minutes. But then when Ashley Babbitt is killed in the Capitol by law enforcement on Wednesday, the picture's quite different. We see EMTs rendering her aid and reeling her out into an ambulance. Now, as time has gone on, we've seen other visuals of Ashley come out of this, but we are not subjected to this continuous cartoon loop over breakfast, lunch, dinner, and the 11 o'clock news before you go to bed of her death and how horrific it was. So what's the difference? Both of these individuals were killed by law enforcement. The answer is entitlement, white privilege, and white supremacy. That's the difference. Ashley is a white woman who's being afforded a humanity, humility, and hubris that George Floyd, a Black man, could never ask for and could never receive. Recently, even closer to home, we've seen where the UK basketball team is being vilified in the news for kneeling at a recent game. There's been news of their paraphernalia being burned, that if you bring the gear in, we'll trade it for a Blue Lives Matter shirt. There's been statements about the guys are out of control, they're unpatriotic. So, but look at the picture behind me. What's the difference here? And, you know, and more than half of UK's basketball team, it should be noted, are students of color. And, you know, so those statements and these actions that we're seeing are dog whistles because the embers of white supremacy are still being tended by people. And so Wednesday seems not to have mattered. And we're trying to go back to some sort of normal, which I'm hoping we don't go back to. We're living in two Americas now, one for white people and one for everyone else. Black people, indigenous people, other people of color have endured oppression and systemic racism for centuries. I'm not shocked by what happened Wednesday. I'm shocked, but I'm not surprised, I should say. There's been discontent since the Reconstruction for Black people. For every step forward that they make, there are potholes and roadblocks put in the way. And again, we see a sense of force being used against people who were peacefully protesting. They were not there throwing bottles or Molotov cocktails. They didn't come with sticks and batons and Confederate flags and that kind of thing to protest that Black people in this country should matter. I'm heartened to see that the tide is shifting. There's news that many large donors and funders are ceasing to support many of these people we voted into office that supposedly represent us, the people, or we the people. I find this interesting as people are running for cover, but it doesn't speak to what Dr. Hess just talked about, the lack of response to a 35-minute walk from the Capitol from the White House to the Capitol that people could have been mobilized. Amazon doesn't sell a blanket big enough to cover the many people that are backtracking and scrubbing their social media platforms. You know, if anything positive is to come of this current shame, for lack of a better term, we've got to be actively interested in wanting to see difference in this world and being the purveyors of that difference. Our future depends on what we do in the present. The lack of enforcement, if you will, and taking it serious, the social media posts that were out there for all the world to see, whether it was on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, or on Parler, or any of those other opportunities, it was there for weeks. People were planning out front, very transparently, what they were going to do. At what point did anyone who was watching what happened see the noose for Pence or hear when they stormed the Capitol that they were looking for Nancy Pelosi to kill her. At what point did somebody say, we probably should do something about this? When you've got, on the flip side, all summer long, peaceful protests. Yeah, was there some looting? But there was some looting, yes, on both sides. But now our democracy has been trampled on. And how are we going to fix that? So in my opinion, strictly, I don't know if anyone else shares it, there is a difference in the way that Black people in this country are seen by law enforcement and the powers that be, in so much that we need to be strong-armed, manhandled, and treated like animals in the street, as opposed to white supremacy coming up Pennsylvania Avenue for 35 minutes, who need to have selfies and be escorted down the Capitol steps once they got finished looting and rioting inside the Capitol.
Thank you, Dr. Denney. We're now going to go to Dr. Jackson. What do you think were the motivations of the rioters? What were their objectives? And perhaps could you speak to any factors that perhaps led to their motivations?
Sure. And thanks for the question. I think it's an important question. I would argue that it's quite likely that the folks that were present at the rally, right, at the start of this, were probably, they were all there for similar motives, right? It's a significant portion of our population that feels threatened by changing demographics. They're threatened by the processes moving towards equity and those processes that give voice to those who've actually been marginalized. And they perceive this as a threat to arguably their own kind of unrecognized privilege. And they see themselves as victims and targets in this changing world. And they see Trump particularly as a hero, champion, savior, at the very least just a voice for their fear-driven worldview. In terms of objectives, though, I think that's where we may start to see some differences, at least at the beginning. It's becoming quite clear, I think, through media investigations and what we're seeing, that certainly some were there with the clear intent of breaching the doors of the Capitol building, disrupting the verification of the Electoral College votes, and harming members of Congress. But I wouldn't be terribly surprised to discover that perhaps a significant number really just came for the rally and the show, right? They didn't know that this is necessarily where things were going to head. But the thing is, when it comes to crowds, this is where it starts to get kind of interesting, and also in this case, a little bit scary. It only takes a few folks taking action to get a group to act when we gather together in a like-minded group, right? When we're all experiencing the same emotion as they were, which was anger, right? This is an angry crowd. What you get are a couple of things. One is a bit of a positive feedback loop, this kind of emotional contagion. You get a group of, when we feel angry and we're around other people who are also angry, we get angrier. And the crowd, in essence, the crowd kind of feeds off itself. So those emotions really get heightened, right? But there's also, and this comes from a few decades of research in social psychology about crowds. We know that crowds actually can turn aggressive pretty quickly, particularly when everybody is on the same page emotionally. But throw into that a couple of other things. One, this kind of anonymity that we feel when we're immersed in a crowd, although I know that's kind of a bit hard to swallow in these days where we're surrounded by cameras, right? And everything is being recorded all the time. But I would argue that it's so ubiquitous that we've become numb to it, right? We're not necessarily conscious of that all the time. So in the crowd, we feel this kind of protection of the crowd. We also experience oftentimes this state that psychologists call de-individuation, where we kind of lose touch with our own self-concept and kind of embrace the crowd self-concept, right? And so what you get is the potential for folks in this de-individuated state who may individually not necessarily engage in violent or aggressive behavior, but can get swept up right in that violent and aggressive behavior when there are folks who are in the crowd that push it in that direction. And I think that's what we saw, right? We saw this tinderbox of emotion being whipped up by the rally, and those few that had this purpose in mind and a target that was easily available, right, just down the street. And so we see them take the lead, and everybody kind of follows course. So yeah, and of course, in the end, I would suggest that, what I'm offering here are explanations, and just that, explanations, certainly not excuses or justifications. I mean, the people that are involved are the people that are involved, right? I mean, the acts that were committed are the acts that were committed. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Dr. Doogie, what impact is the incident likely to have on American politics heading forward? Obviously, we're looking at impeachments right now, but what do you see in the short term as well as the long term? Your mic is off, Dr. Doogie.
Right, I got it. Last I saw, the impeachment proceeding was the resolution, House Resolution 24 was passing, 10 Republicans joining the Democrats. Now, listening to the proceedings didn't shed much light about where we were headed. However, it was clear that a number of Trump supporters were portraying him as a victim. There was a lot of special pleading going on with respect to him. There was misinterpretation of constitutional law, appeals to the fear of immigrants, faulty comparisons. For example, comparing what happened in places like Portland to what happened at the Capitol. Again, the Capitol is a very different place than Portland, Oregon. And it's not just the symbolism, it's the reality that's different as well. Clearly, it's obvious that, and no mention of the disparity in response was offered either. Remember that you had a pretty serious governmental response to demonstrations in other cities. Not so much in the Capitol event, as Professor Hess has reported. It's clearly the case that many of the Republicans in the House have not changed their mind. Indeed, their rhetoric is suggestive somewhat of what Professor David Blight, a constitutional historian, has suggested might happen, and that is the Trumpian lost cause, a sort of parallel to the Confederate lost cause. And thanks to Guy Waldrop for referring this piece to me. Next week, I'm going to talk about the short term first and then the long term. Next week, we're likely to see a number of violent demonstrations. It's been projected that there'll be some in DC and perhaps in several states, perhaps most states for all I know. I'm not privy to that information at present, but it's certainly the case that there are likely to be demonstrations and violent demonstrations in some of these places. I'm worried also about what we might call soft targets, namely things like will be happening on Monday, the Martin Luther King Jr. marches. Clearly, white supremacists were involved in what went on last Wednesday, and I wouldn't be totally confident that they might not attack some of these Martin Luther King Jr. marches. Interestingly, there have also been short-term effects on foreign policy. Mike Pompeo was supposed to go to Luxembourg, a relatively wealthy, small place, but one that can contribute to NATO. He was disinvited by the foreign minister and eventually canceled his trip. He was also supposed to go to Brussels. In fact, the foreign minister, Jean Asselborn, was quoted as calling Trump, and I love this expression, a political pyromaniac. It's an interesting turn of phrase. The long term is more difficult to assess. Clearly, the racist aspects that have been promoted by President Trump are likely to persist. Now, again, in fairness to the Republican Party, there is diversity there, and there are a number of different factions in the party. Remember, it's been split in a number of different ways over the last 15 years or so. Tea Party, alt-right, all these different elements within the same party. But it's clear that the leadership in the party, in the form of the presidents, Republican presidents, have used race as, well, have exploited race and ancillary issues to create wedge issues in the voting public. And I don't see that ending anytime soon. We could hope for some kind of generational effect. Remember, the attitudes about things like gay marriage change generationally. I'm not sure that's likely to happen with respect to race. And this, Trump, one of the things that happened in the Trump prior to Trump, these were relatively isolated. They didn't have a lot of connections. They didn't have a lot of interaction. Now, obviously, through social media and Trump's leadership, they established these sorts of connections. And why is that important? Well, because if Trump as president can say and do bad things to minorities, whether African-American, Hispanic, Muslim, gender orientation, whatever, then these people think it's perfectly okay for them to do it as well. So that's an issue. It's also an open question about how these groups will operate after the unifying force of Trump is lost. But it's clear that people like those last Wednesday's riot will not disappear anytime soon. Excuse me. And obviously there's an interest on the part of a number of Republicans who fancy themselves presidential candidates in the next presidential election, people like Ted Cruz and Hawley and people like that, who want to continue to rely on the Trump base. And so they're going to play to that base as well. What's going to happen to Trump? Clearly, to lead the Republican Party. I don't think he'll be successful in winning another national office. Perhaps because he'll be barred as a consequence of the impeachment proceedings, or perhaps because of the bar that comes from Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. But it may just be that when you lose, and you're not likely to be reelected. Losing candidates rarely are successful subsequently. I think we've had one situation with that in our history. Now, what's going to happen to the party, the Republican Party? Well, obviously it's splintered. We know that. There's rumored that another conservative party will emerge, involving conservatives like Romney and Sassy from Nebraska. Whether or not that'll happen remains to be seen, but clearly it's the case that there are going to be some additional factions that come out of this situation. But at the same time, while the saying may have been false about Mark Twain, that his demise was exaggerated, it certainly would be an exaggeration to state that the Republican Party is in demise. What about future elections? Clearly, there are serious issues in our electoral system. Think about it. It brought you Trump. There were 16 Republican candidates in the primaries in 2016. And some of those folks were actually decent people. And we ended up, now in part, it's not just the electoral system, it's also media. And I'm not just talking about partisan media. Mainstream media is in business. They're in business to sell advertising. And so they focus on things that are sensational. And so the candidates that are more outrageous are going to get more attention. And clearly that was Trump. So again, it's estimated he got $2 billion in free advertising during those primaries. that's insane. The Electoral College is also a problem. And it's not just a problem for presidential elections. We've seen since 2000 presidents being elected without majority of the popular vote. That happened in 2016, despite President Trump's denials. Again, the majority of the population's wishes are not being met through the Electoral College. It also is the case that the basis for that Electoral College, the idea that we have 2 senators and at least 1 representative in every state, skews what happens in our Senate. If you look at the last 4 years, we've had an incredible number of federal judges confirmed by a majority of senators who represent a considerable minority of the population. Again, it's not just in terms of presidential elections that we have problems. What will the new administration bring? I wish I knew. There's some cause for hope because the people who are being appointed appear to be being appointed on the basis of competence rather than on the basis of nepotism and cronyism, which was the basis for most of the appointments made by Trump. And the problem, of course, is that the hope is largely tied to a 2-year window at present. Remember, we have midterms in 2 years, and who knows what midterms will bring. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Doogie. Dr. Hallman, what is the likely impact of suspending the President of the United States from social media platforms? And you can also speak to communication and those digital platforms in general when it comes to this specific situation that happened on January 6th.
Thanks. I think that's a good question, and there are a lot of different ways to think about it. What are the likely impacts of suspending the president? Well, for the president himself, he's likely to find other platforms, other places to spread his views. And we saw that happening right away when he decided to jump over and tweet from the POTUS Twitter handle instead of his individual Twitter handle. And we've already seen him, getting his messages out through Fox News and other places. So it's certainly not going to silence him just by suspending his Twitter account. What are some other implications? What are some other impacts? Well, some people, as we've seen, have gotten mad. They've wrongly suggested that this is a violation of the First Amendment. Of course, the First Amendment is limiting what government can do, not what companies like Twitter and Facebook and other social media can do, particularly when those companies, as Twitter does, have been strengthening their user agreements and the policies and the things that people are agreeing to when they sign up to use their services. So if someone violates those, certainly they can suspend an account or take not as severe measures. I think we'll probably see, and have already started to see, more conversations about what needs to happen so that our laws and our understandings of sort of civic discourse are keeping up with the changes that have happened because of digital tools that have become more common. I think, thinking about one of the big concerns, as some of the other panelists have already mentioned, in thinking about Trump's use of social media is the way that he was using social media to sort of unite different groups under a larger banner, and the way that social media by people in far-right groups and white supremacist groups have used Twitter and Facebook and other social media platforms to organize and to plan things like what happened last Wednesday. Suspending Trump from Twitter is certainly not going to stop those conversations from happening. It will probably move them into other spaces. We've seen already, I heard on the New York Times, The Daily podcast this morning, that Telegram, which is an encrypted messaging app that has been around for a while, but it's seen as an alternative space to these more mainstream places like Twitter and Facebook. It's a more private space, not as easily monitored. Telegram had 25 million new users over the past few days. Of course, that's probably for lots of different reasons. But that's a lot of people migrating from one place to another or taking up space in multiple places. Is this making the organizing, is suspending Trump from Twitter making it harder for folks to organize the sorts of things like what happened last Wednesday? Maybe, but probably not. And in fact, then by pushing these groups, the people who showed up on Wednesday that wanted to incite violence, that wanted to threaten people, that wanted to send certain messages by wearing shirts that said Camp Auschwitz and by hanging news, clear symbols that we don't have to be trained rhetoricians to understand what kind of a message they're supposed to be sending. It may be harder to monitor activity if folks are pushed away from more mainstream platforms like Twitter and Facebook, which again, as several panelists have noted, like this was not, the planning for the past Wednesday was not hidden. Lots of people saw it happening. Facebook had even taken down some groups, the Stop the Steal groups that had sprouted up and started planning things. But at that point, you know, the plan was in motion, a date had been set and things were already moving. So just like taking Trump off of Twitter isn't going to stop this type of activity the same way that taking that Stop the Steal off of Facebook didn't stop last Wednesday. The events that transpired didn't stop those from happening.
Thank you, Dr. Hallman. Thank you, panel, for answering these questions. We are now going to move on to the next portion of this discussion where you, the audience, can submit questions to our panelists and speaker. Once again, you can ask a question by typing in the Q&A box. The Q&A icon is found at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will do the best I can to get to as many questions as possible, but there are definitely a lot right now. So I will read off the question that I received, some of them targeted more towards a specific professor or speaker, and you will each have 2 minutes to respond if, of course, you choose to respond. So the first question is to Dr. Jackson, which says, could you speak a little bit more to the role that conspiracy theories played in these events, and how can we combat the entrenched beliefs like conspiracy theories like the QAnon have pushed out to certain demographics?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly that kind of stuff plays a huge role, not only in sort of instigating this, but perpetuating it as well. And I certainly wish there was an easy solution, but for folks in particular who, really endorse these conspiracies, it's like a delusion, right? So that there's a couple of things. One, little evidence that you can provide that will change their minds about things. And they also tend to only seek out information that fits their expectations, that just, again, kind of perpetuates this as well. Probably the best that you can do, well, I should also back up. And we have to think of it as like folks along a continuum too, right? Some folks are really, hardcore QAnon folks. And then there are other folks who are kind of on the fence, right? And so they may be a little more susceptible to this, but they're not necessarily deep into it as others might be. Regardless, the best thing that you can do is not necessarily be particularly confrontational, especially if we're talking about people that we know and that we care about, perhaps. Because any kind of confrontation really just, walls come up, right? And they're not going to listen to anything. But just, it's about a constant planting of seeds of doubt, right? The only thing that's going to drag someone out of the depths of a delusion ultimately are themselves, right? And they have to start to doubt the way that they see the world.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Speaking to QAnon, we know that there were definitely some motivations there in terms of them being a part of the Republican Party. And we even saw a representative who was vocally supportive about QAnon being elected to the House of Representatives. So Dr. Doogie and Dr. Hess, can you speak to the Republican Party and the factions and division within the party today? And how do you think the party is going to deal with these changes? Are we going to see them push away certain factions, or are they going to accept more of these factions to kind of grow the base? And finally, let's see, do you see a third party challenge perhaps coming out of this situation if the Republican Party cannot get it together? So Dr. Hess, I'll let you go first, and then Dr. Doogie, I'll let you go second.
So we have, you see this this kind of confusion and fracturing within the Republican Party. If you were to ask a few years ago, you would say that there's quite a bit of ideological consistency that's appeared within the Republican Party about small government, free market economics, etc. But there was always this undercurrent in which identity politics really played an important role, and you saw that the party was very racially homogenous. It's increasingly dependent on rural voters. In the last two cycles, the two parties have become really, the Democrats and the Republicans have become really divided on the basis of educational attainment. So what Trump has really done is really refocused the identity aspect of the Republican Party and really centered in on a lot of politics of white grievance, the idea that demographics of the country are changing and that the position that this group has enjoyed in the past is going away, and tapped into a lot of things like cultural anxiety and seeing how the country is changing in unwanted ways, and a lot of people are feeling that the country that they are accustomed to and that they're comfortable with is slowly going away. And with that, we saw with Trump initially when he was a candidate, we saw a lot of talk about economic populism and infrastructure development and protectionism and free trade. And a big focus on controlling immigration. And, a lot of those things resonated with white working class voters. And there was some tension in that rhetoric with what Republican Party like economic orthodoxy would provide, massive spending on infrastructure, protectionism and on free trade. Those are things that were really anathema to a lot of the thinkers in the establishment of the Republican Party. And so what'll be kind of interesting is what happens after Trump. Does the Republican Party does it endorse some of those new views? Does it focus more on identity issues? Does it focus on economic populism? Or is it going to follow, what we're seeing right now, where we see like Senator McConnell trying to sort of restore the old normal, right, in the party in a way. And we've even heard him, I don't know if I doubt if he's admitted this, but there's been reporting that he sort of smiles, he smiles favorably upon the impeachment that just happened a few minutes ago, right? That it can put Trump as under arrest and the Republican Party can kind of move back to the old normal. And so it's kind of an open question what'll happen. Will the Republican Party splinter? Will it endorse this sort of authoritarian populist view? Or will we go back to the old like Mitt Romney post-mortem after 2012, in which the Republican Party says, we have to expand our demographics, expand our base. We have to lose the identity politics aspect of our platform and try to reach out more to voters of color. It seems, it seems like a big unknown. And although I should say that just structurally in terms of our institutions, it really almost always falls down back into two-partyism. So if there is any splintering, we will find some kind of two-party equilibrium very soon.
Thank you, Dr. Hess. Dr. Doogie.
Well, in addition to what Professor Hess has suggested, I would remind people that among the so-called conservatives in the Republican Party, there's a diversity of conservatism. Economic conservatives, social conservatives, cultural conservatives, all sorts of conservatives. And one of the things that may happen to change some of the organization of the party, historically what happened is the party was dominated by economic conservatives, and they gained support from these other types of conservatives, particularly the social conservatives, for example, the evangelicals for Trump. One of the things that may happen given the reconstruction of the Supreme Court is that after almost 50 years, Roe v. Wade may be declared unconstitutional, be overturned. That puts the Republican Party in a bad place because they've relied on claiming that they were opposed to abortion as a campaign issue for so long. What happens if the social conservatives now become more concerned about social justice, for example? It remains to be seen. It's also the case, as I pointed out earlier, that there's some talk about an emerging new conservative party, which might be what Professor Hess described as the old-fashioned Republican Party. Again, there are lots of possibilities here. In the short run, it's very difficult to say, especially since we don't know how Trump is going to impact what happens to the Republican Party. Again, it may well be that he'll become viewed as a martyr, and we'll have this, what Blight called the Trumpian lost cause mentality going forward in the party.
Dr. Denney, so we saw through pictures multiple Blue Lives Matter flags. We also know that in response to Black Lives Matter over the summer and those protests and that movement in general, we really saw the rise of conservatives and the Republican parties really joining arms with this Blue Lives Matter movement. However, on the day of January 6th, we see protesters coming in direct conflict, very hostily, very aggressively with law enforcement. And we know that one law enforcement officer actually died due to these riots. What is your opinion about Blue Lives Matter in regards to this specific situation? And how do we deal with Blue Lives Matter going forward? Are they a legitimate organization that is, or movement that really has concern for our law enforcement officers, or are they really just a facade for a hatred against perhaps the Black Lives Matter movement?
Thank you for the question. So I think that Blue Lives Matter, it has the same optics and a problem with optics that Black Lives Matter has, that it's very focused on a particular group of people. And it requires you to take a side. When I looked at the visuals from what happened on Wednesday, and yes, there were law enforcement officers, current and past, that were part of that, it didn't make me think that all law enforcement was bad or that all law enforcement had it in for Black people or just indigenous people at large. So I think that you have to peel back that onion like you do everything else and really be thoughtful about what are we talking about? What part of the rhetoric of Blue Lives Matter resonates with you that you support? What part of Black Lives Matter, what their rhetoric, what do you support or what do you move forward? And we have to be very careful because it becomes another tool to divide us. And that's not what we should be thinking about or trying to do today, or really any time in our history. We need to figure out how to collectively move this democracy forward in a way that everyone gets what we claim they are supposed to have: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's for everybody. That's not just for one group. And so for me, I think it's very problematic when we try to compare groups against one or the other. because within every group, there's going to be a faction or a small part that may not fall in line with what the original understanding and the original vision of that group was for.
Thank you, Dr. Denney. I have a question for Dr. Hallman, Dr. Jackson, and Dr. Doogie even. Could you discuss how we balance freedom of speech versus controlling disinformation through the media and social media platforms? We know that Twitter has been a little bit more active in terms of saying fact-checking things and just altogether removing things, the information that's not correct. How do we deal with that in terms of living in a society that values that freedom of speech as an inherent right? I'll start with Dr. Hallman, and then we'll go Dr. Jackson, and then Dr. Doogie.
Sure. Thank you. It is tricky. I think if there was an easy answer to that, you know, Twitter and Facebook would have done it by now. They would have said, like, here's how we're going to deal with this. And instead, they keep retooling the, you know, agreements that people have to say that they're going to abide by in order to use their platforms. So I don't think that there is an easy answer, because people are always going to question whether what was done was the right thing. You know, I said earlier, by suspending Trump from Twitter, that pushes people into places, other apps and other darker corners of the internet that are harder to monitor and harder to track. So whereas we might see it as a good thing to limit what Trump is able to say in Twitter by, you know, suspending his account, because we want it to help keep people safe, right? Like that would be the reason that we would be suspending his account. We don't want him to incite more violence. By suspending that account, though, at the same time, we're pushing people into these places that are harder to monitor, which could also be a safety concern. So it really is a very complicated thing to try to come up with a good solution. I think something to keep in mind as we're thinking about a question like that is, you know, this idea of there being sort of a marketplace of ideas, this public sphere where everybody is able to speak and share ideas. That's sort of always been something that we've hoped existed in democratic societies in particular. But we know from lessons of history, from rhetorical research from a very long time, that those are never equal spaces. No one ever, it's not that people enter into those spaces with equal ability to have their voices be heard. And when platforms like Twitter and Facebook first came out, when the internet even first came out, it was really seen as this like utopic place where everyone's ideas were going to be easily shared, and we wouldn't be judging people based on you know, identity markers like their skin color. We would be judging them on the merit of their idea, and yet we've seen that obviously that's not what happened. So I think that's why we do still need to really think about questions like this. I want to not say too much, since other folks may have something to say about it too.
Go ahead, Dr. Jackson.
Sure. I'd kind of like to add too, because I know what comes up in these conversations all the time is, the social media create for us these echo chambers, right, where we just hear back our own ideas, and that exacerbates, things. And yes, that is true. I mean, it's an amplification of a normal human tendency, that we have this great marketplace of ideas that everybody's free to share, and that we do seek out and embrace dissenting opinions is a bit of a myth, right? When we look at the people that we choose to surround ourselves with, they tend to be folks that agree with us, right? We find this very affirming. So I think the social media itself isn't necessarily the problem, but it does make the problem worse, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Dr. Doogie, can you speak to freedom of speech and disinformation?
Yeah, Jackson's right about making the problem worse. Clearly, at the inception of this country, when we relied on newspapers that very few people could read, communication was a very different thing. Social media, media in general, 24-hour news stations, all of these things have changed considerably, and people do self-select. Again, we've known since Aristotle, birds of a feather flock together, right? So it's a problem. One of the things that concerns me about social media, and it's very different than what we've had in terms of direct communication or traditional forms of communication, is anonymity. People are able to make outrageous claims, say awful things, and not accept responsibility for it. I think we should be responsible for our actions, and I don't see that happening to a large extent with social media. Again, people are able to maintain anonymity to a large extent. Now, in terms of freedom of speech generally, obviously, all of these are privately owned platforms. Now, there is some potential for governmental regulation. For example, the Computer Decency Act and Section 230 has an impact on this sort of thing. But when it comes to free speech, as Professor Hallman mentioned earlier, it's primarily the relationship between government and individuals that we're talking about, not between private corporations and individuals. Private corporations can do whatever they please with respect to your speech. They can kick you off, they can let you do what you want, they can choose. The government is more limited. But even so, I'm not sure that some of the principles employed with relation to government might not apply. For example, anytime you're talking about limiting speech by government, there are three major considerations: time, place, and manner. When it's happening, how it's happening, and where it's happening. And sometimes what we do would be acceptable at a particular place and time and unacceptable at another place and time. It seems to me that these private companies could be a bit more sensitive to those sorts of considerations.
Thank you, Dr. Doogie. This last question is more targeted towards Dr. Denney and Dr. Hess, but if Dr. Hallman, Jackson, or Doogie have something to contribute to this discussion or this question, definitely chime in. So we got a question that said, recently the Chronicle of Higher Education has published articles on the role of colleges and universities in this attack. One is titled, "Colleges Share the Blame for the Assault on Democracy." What role do you think colleges and universities had in the attack? And what is the responsibility of administrators, faculty, and students in the response? Professor Hess, I'll let you go first, and then Dr. Denney.
I mean, there's certainly some blame to be focused on our educational system, from K to 12 all the way up to universities. You know, we've really continued to follow this this path in which we focus more on professional preparation, right, and super specialization, and we focus less on, you know, a broadly minded person, you know, a person that is, you know, that is familiar with the social sciences, you know, the humanities, the fine arts. You know, how many times have we seen, you know, the gutting of art programs, you know, of theater, performing arts programs? You know, we need people and citizens that can think creatively. We need people that can draw connections, that people that can think independently and are not used to rote thinking, right? So we have something to blame in the sense that we've focused a lot on just to please, you know, to please customers, to attract people that say, I want a degree to get a job, you know, when really we should be developing the whole person more, right? So there should be, from top to bottom, from kindergarten, children should play more, there should be less standardized testing. There should be, there should be so much more focus just on creating people of character, that can have difficult conversations with one another. And also just, in higher education, that we can be really discerning about materials. We can be independent investigators of what is true and what is not true. It makes such a difference that people have these kinds of skills, and it's completely essential to have engaged, independently thinking citizens in order to have a sustained democracy.
So piggybacking on Steve, I agree with him on all of that. The transactional nature that higher education has become, the standardized test that you teach to the test in K through 12 instead of creating citizens that are thinking and innovative and able to assess truth from fiction. All of those things lead to the deterioration of our democracy when we don't have people who are skilled or educated or knowledgeable to be able to attest what is real and what is not, and to name things that are just kind of in their delusion, and no one's suffering the consequences. That's the problem with social media. Like Dr. Doogie said, there are no consequences there. And so people can just say whatever. But I also think that there's a piece to it that we have taken out of education. We've taken it out of the hands of faculty. We have moved it into a stream of consciousness where we have to turn out people who can be engineers, who can be these certain and specific things, because our economy has changed, our world is changing. And so education has a little burden to bear here, because we need to change as well. And the student from 15 years ago or 10 years ago is not the student that you have today, because education has changed in that amount of time. And you've got to teach the person that sits in front of you, not the person you wish they were. And so there's a fault on all sides, if you will, in my opinion. And how can we get alignment, true alignment for liberal arts education, which is so important in this day and age? I mean, being at Transy in this time, having these faculty members and an opportunity like this to discuss these issues is key and important. And not a lot of places are having these discussions or opportunities for students, faculty, administrators, or anyone else to share, and our alumni in the outside world. So we need more dialogue, and we need more understanding of, if we're going to have a democracy, what is it going to look like from now till forever? Otherwise, what we've seen, we're going to see more of that. And while education has some burden to bear, it's not totally responsible.
If I could add too, I think part of it as well is, because the funding for higher education at the public level has been hollowed out for the past few decades, it's putting access, because of cost, out of reach for a lot of folks, right? So, yeah. And of course, they're sold two conflicting stories, that you have to have a college education to succeed, but you've got to go into debt to get a college education, which then inhibits success. And so in that sense, it's all problematic. So I think accessibility is a big issue as well.
I would point out that one of the problems is that it's clear that universities in particular, and also perhaps liberal arts colleges, bear some responsibility. But remember, people are relatively well-formed in terms of their habits of mind by the time they get to us. And that creates a real problem. The teaching to exams and things like that tends to occur mostly in elementary and secondary schools. And so when that kind of conditioning, I think, makes it difficult unlearning is a hell of a lot harder than learning. And so that's a problem for us, I think, at the college and university level.
Dr. Hallman, do you have any last words or anything to contribute to this specific question?
I think anything I would have said has already been said, and since we're already running over a little bit, I'll not add anything else.
Okay, thank you. As we come to the conclusion of our panel discussion, I want to thank our panelists for their time, the insightful information and thoughtfulness in the discussion of such an interesting day in American history. I appreciate our panel for enlightening us on these events and what to expect moving forward. I would also like to thank our audience for attending this discussion and for your questions. I apologize for not getting to all of them, but I hope you feel like you were able to gain some information from what we were able to answer. I hope that you feel more informed on this situation and feel compelled in whatever capacity or role you possess to continue working on making this nation a more perfect union despite the turmoil and tension we may currently feel as Americans. I'll remind you that this evening's program will be available on Transylvania University's YouTube channel with closed captions, and please be on the lookout for other panel discussions. Be safe and have a great night. Thank you.